Okay, so Malcolm, let's start out today with what it's like to cover the war in Ukraine. Because quite a few American journalists have been killed by the Russian forces. What's it like out there, right? What are the other reporters and correspondents saying? Are the Russian forces targeting journalists? And have you had any close calls yourself?
Well, as you know, I left the night of the war struck. And I'm since back. I'm actually in Poland now. But let me tell you what I'm hearing from the journalists who are here. And that, first off, I don't think that they are specifically being targeted. I think the Russians are just targeting everyone. And the few incidents that have occurred, the one that was most likely the most tragic was the loss of the New York Times journalist who was in the city of Irpin, which is heavily contested city to the north of Kyiv. And to get to Irpin, you have to go across a bridge that's been blown up. You have to go down into it. And then, there are cars there that were abandoned and people had been, taking these commandeered cars. But at some point, you're going to run into the Russians. And the Russians are not checking for press badges. Any vehicle they see, they just assume is the enemy and they shoot to kill. And that's how the Sky News was ambushed about 2 weeks ago in that exact same area. And then there's indirect fire, there's mortars, there's rockets, things that fall from the sky. There was a young Russian journalist, pro-Ukrainian journalist, who was killed at the site of a Russian rocket attack. And she was, tragically, they struck the same place again. Excuse me. So there are many dangers out there. It has nothing to do with journalism. It has to do with the war. So if journalists are getting killed in this capacity, the average civilian in those areas who have to live there, they're being killed as well.
So I think you're referring to Alexandra. They used to call her Sasha, right? Kushinova. Right. Is the female journalist, the Ukrainian journalist that was killed in that area. The American journalist that you were referring to, I don't know if he was New York Times, the photojournalist, Brent Renault is who it was. But But then there's also, there was another U.S. journalist, what was his name? Trey Yingst, who I forget whether he was actually killed or he was severely injured while he was with, I believe, this Ukrainian journalist at the time. There was a third, but I know he was actually, Benjamin Hall was wounded, as well. My point being that this is quite an awful mess that's going on here, right? Where it almost seems, now I'm taking your word for it because this is what you do, and I certainly accede to your professionalism and your knowledge. But it almost seems to me as if though they are attacking journalists because they don't want the information to be getting out there. Hence the reason why they knocked out that tower that was 1,000 miles away from Kiev or Kharkov at the time.
Well, they knocked out Kyiv's main television tower, which I had seen many times before. I know the first time I saw that tower, I said, this thing's not going to last a week in the war. It took the Russians almost 3 weeks to do it. But information they're finding it more effective to use the same disinformation paths that you were a victim of in the United States by their allies in the United States. Just look at some of the people who are pushing Russian propaganda for them, who have an enormous reach. Tucker Carlson started out this war and the run up to this war solidly pro-Putin, solidly pro-Russia, and was, sort of couching it in these, do you think maybe, Vladimir Putin did something wrong, or could, in these ways that were sort of, giving him a pass while creating enough doubt that Tucker Carlson was pretending to be a journalist. right? So, I mean, no matter what artillery does here, what sniper bullets do here, what driving up to a checkpoint does, that absolutely, injures, impacts, and kills journalists. There's nothing more deadly, pervasive than the American fifth columnist who pretend that they're, supporting the goals of democracy in America and the Constitution while holding water for a Russian ex-KGB dictator. I'm looking at you, Tucker Carlson. I'm looking at you, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, just disgraceful. Madison Cawthorn, every one of you who is just a pro-Moscow shill. And, I'm sure you're going to get paid in undervalued rubles someday, or get a friendship medal from Vladimir Putin. But they're far more deadly than the bullets that are killing journalists on the battlefield.
A couple of weeks ago, I had General Mark Hertling on the show. And one of the things that he had said to me, which really made me think, it made me ponder heavily, when he said that it's no longer misinformation and disinformation campaign. There's also this new concept of malinformation that, they're putting out there. What do you know about that? Because again, this is your world.
Yeah. And, disinformation and misinformation are actually terms of intelligence art, where, back in the period of the Soviet Union, they had entire organizations set up for this. Every one of their news organizations was set up as a massive lie machine. You might remember Pravda back in the old days, right? Their Communist Party newspaper.
I thought you were talking. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about Prada. The store on Madison Avenue. No, I'm talking about. I am familiar with Pravda.
Yeah, but Pravda meant, quote, literally the word meant truth, and when you heard it in the West, it meant lie. Russia has cleverly changed that by, when they had that early embrace of democracy in the 1990s. They had news organizations breaking out. Americans were working over there. That changed under Vladimir Putin. He went back to the old system. He immediately consolidated all the news to be either infotainment or entertainment, variety shows and TV shows. And then he consolidated all of the government information into one channel, his channel, right? Sort of like, imagine the United States only had OANN, right? Or news, or Fox News, and no other source of information. So disinformation, as a term of intelligence art, is where you manipulate information in order to come to a desired result. Misinformation is a mix of truth, half-truths, and lies, right? In order to lead you to disinformation. Malinformation is sort of like, two fingers being held up, both hands at the truth. And it is a flat out manufactured lie. The guy you used to work for, Donald Trump.
You have to remind me that, Malcolm. I thought we were friends.
Yeah, but he wasn't a master of disinformation or misinformation. Donald Trump was a pathological liar. He would manufacture from whole cloth insane things. And in his crazy world, it was the truth as far as he cared. And he wasn't concerned about what you thought or another person thought, but just the true believers thought, the Jim Jones effect. And it's ironic that Jim Jones, when he caused all those people to drink poison cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, actually had a sign over them that said, "Those who forget, those who forget history tend to repeat it." And the same thing goes with information and truth. Those who traffic in misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, are aware that they are repeating this in order to create an alternate reality. The Russians call it perception management, right? Reflexive control, to where they actually control what you believe, and they create that bubble. Malinformation is a critical component of that. Vladimir Putin is now living in that bubble. And the question is, and this is another one that harks back to your buddy Donald Trump, when they believe that information in that malinformation sphere, they start making decisions based on the lies that they live. That's the most dangerous, pervasive part of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Vladimir Putin may suddenly believe that there are biological weapons in a US lab in Kharkiv or Kyiv or Lviv, and act on it with chemical weapons himself or nuclear weapons. Who knows? But he gets feedback, Mike, from Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so when he sees on Russia Today, Marjorie Taylor Greene saying there are American biological weapons labs in Ukraine, malinformation makes him believe it, even though he generated it. Oh, it's a cycle of danger here.
Yeah, and we don't call it here in New York malinformation. We just call it straight up bullshit. Because that's really just what it is. It's just bullshit. There was a name that came across that I heard she also, a journalist, was killed, Oksana Bolina. And yes. I don't know, where was she? What happened? I know she was like on the air speaking or something. I know she had something to do with Navalny, who we all know is the gentleman that was going to run against Putin, that was basically taken and tortured for quite a while. What happened to her?
I referenced her earlier. She was an ethnic Russian who was reporting here in Ukraine, who was anti-Moscow, and she was at the site of the mall, which was struck the other day by a missile and destroyed, which we now suspect was targeted with a drone. That they had a Orlan 10 drone flying over there and targeted that place. And it turned out that they struck it again the next day while she was there reporting on the previous strike. A beautiful young woman lost in her prime, trying to bring truth to her own country that just now traffics in mass murder and death. Terrible.
Wonderful, right? But, going back to this whole thing of the misinformation, disinformation, and now malinformation, do you think that there's a group within Russian intelligence that's actually tasked with making up this stuff and then disseminating it? Because I know we have as we would say in Russian, the durak, right? This idiot, Tucker Carlson, and so many others, that continue and promote this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. But my real question to you is, do you have any intelligence as to whether or not Putin has created a task force in order to do this? Because with Trump, it was just me and a bunch of other people, like the Dan Scavinos, the Don Juniors, Ivankas, Jared's, Mark Meadows, prior to that, the rancid penises of the world, Reince Priebus, and so many others inside, the White House, just helping to promote this to any unwitting fool that was willing to listen, and then to continue to, to promote that information.
When I wrote my first book about the Trump-Russia scandal, which I wrote and published 8 weeks before the election, called The Plot to Hack America, I had to project what, for all the disinformation and misinformation that we were seeing, and the hacking of the Democratic National Committee, and the result that it was targeted to elevate Trump and hammer down Hillary Clinton, I actually had to use my intelligence experience to draft up how big an organization would it have to be, what levels of management would have to be in there, how many English linguists would they need to have on hand. We know in the Soviet Union, all of Soviet academia was channeled into Russian intelligence, into the KGB, which had disinformation organizations. Whose sole function was to make up lies and then inject those lies into the West. One of the most pervasive and successful ones still exists on the internet. You can Google it. It was a KGB rumor that they managed to get into an Indian newspaper, and somehow it got picked up by a paper in the West, that AIDS was actually manufactured by the CIA in order to infect Haitians and gays, to tear down corrupt society. There are websites that still traffic in that.
Malcolm, are you saying that that's not true?
Well,
now, if I can post something to you here, I don't think that that's the biggest disinformation, misinformation that
I meant prior to
out there.
2016.
Right? Maybe prior to 2016.
Yeah.
I consider the Steele dossier to be the same piece of shit, right? How it managed to get into and promoted. I still believe that this came from somewhere much bigger and much greater than this loser Christopher Steele, right? This worthless piece of shit, with his MI6 background. There was something going on there. Who paid him? How did it end up moving around like this? Where did this information? Now there's stories about that it was that Russia sent somebody to Prague with a passport. That guy's name was Michael Cohen. That, of course, never, ever materialized. Then there was also about my cell phone pinging in some location just outside in Czechoslovakia, outside of Prague, all of this stuff. And a lot of this stuff, they think, obviously came from foreign sources.
Let me enlighten you on this, because I've had lunch with Michael Steele, and we've talked about this subject.
You mean Christopher Steele?
I mean Chris Steele.
Michael Steele. Michael Steele's the former head of the RNC. And if it was Michael Steele, and who's been on the show, I will find him and kick his ass.
I love Michael Steele. He has a
Me
Muppet.
too.
You gotta love anyone that's got a Muppet. So no, Christopher Steele. I've had lunch with Christopher Steele in London. We had a long talk about the methodologies of how this was done. I read the document. I saw, I had a discussion with David Korn before he released the document out there. I've talked to, what's his name? Is it Chris Simpson? Glenn Simpson, on how this thing got, out to other news organizations, BuzzFeed, for example. First off, there is a form of intelligence collection, all right, that is called rumor intelligence, right? Rumint. Rumor intelligence is a viable form of intelligence, because what it is, it's a source that can be cross-checked and should be cross-checked against viable intelligence. This is the old movie trope where the person is walking around a party and listening to what people are saying, right? Or you go into a bar that's favorited by people and you listen to what they're saying, or you hang out near the Russian Duma. Rumor intelligence can be firsthand, where you actually are standing next to that person listening to them. Secondhand, where someone comes and tells you you've heard a rumor, right? Or third hand, where that person heard a guy who heard a guy, right? Usually the way that these things are checked out is through real human intelligence, where we have assets who are paid, who sign contracts, whose job it is to go out and cross-reference that, right? Did Trump actually have hookers in his hotel room, right? Or you have signals intelligence, where somebody is talking about that on a telephone, okay? And there's a rumor intelligence document, and what we do, fusion this information. I had this discussion with Chris. I said, dude, this whole thing looks like Rumint. And he goes, it is Rumint. It is a collection of stories and information which has to be cross-checked by a viable intelligence agency for it to be anything other than Rumint. Now, that crazy Prague story, you and I discussed this a couple of times on this show, right? It was really pushed by some crazy people on the liberal left. Okay. I mean, they were hammering that story. And I said, well, this is pretty easy. All you got to do is cross-reference it to the video cameras at the airport. And if it was real, that shit would have come out in about 30 seconds, right? And it never came out. And as it never came out, I immediately dispelled it, because very easily checkable intelligence would have been able to do it. And it was a country that's part of NATO, right? We do counterintelligence. So that story was crazy and bullshit. And a lot of people ran with that story, for their own personal purposes. A lot of people, like, I don't want to mention somebody.
No, mention. Go ahead. Go for it.
A crazy ex-British member of parliament who's constantly called me a Russian spy, whose name begins with Lois Mensch. They were all hammering these crazy stories. And
do you remember what Louise Mensch, or whatever Louise Mensch, what she turned around and said, which not only was it inaccurate, it's also insulting, that I had a second passport, an Israeli passport, because I'm a Jew. Now, in fact, as I tried to explain, right, yeah, she's fucked up, she's nuts, except the problem is people listen to it. And as I explained to her, I've never been to Israel. Right, I've never been to Israel, which I'd like to go, but I haven't been as of yet. No different. I haven't been to Russia either. But my point is, it wasn't just Louise Mensch. There were others like McClatchy that came out with crazy stories that I came in on some oligarch's yacht, or I took somebody's private plane, or something like that. So I turned around and I said, that's as plausible as me going to Dick's Sporting Goods store, buying a kayak, dropping the fucking kayak in the East River, kayaking my ass over there, right? And then coming back within 24 hours because, as they're well aware, because the FBI did do their homework, right? Even though they still kept holding on to this bullshit document.
Yeah.
They knew I was at USC with my son because they spoke to all the baseball coaches when my son was having a tryout for the team.
Now, there's a theory out there that a lot of this information, or some of that information, could have been planted intelligence. And the thing about rumor intelligence is, and this is why you call it rumor intelligence, is because if you don't cross-reference it with real stuff, it's as good as the stuff Donald Trump says. The whole story of the P tape was so fantastical, right? Now, I'm not saying that it could or couldn't have happened. The thing is that what you do is you quickly cross-reference it. And when the investigative committees cross-referenced it with his bodyguard, right, they couldn't confirm or deny the damn thing. Right. But the point is, if you're going to come up with a stupid story, or you're going to come up with a story, you're going to have crazy stories by crazy people who just want to get stupid stories in your way. I don't think that that report, the Steele report, like some people claim, was a document manufactured by foreign intelligence, because they would have been.
You do not.
No, they would have been more focused, and they would have been more realistic. You're talking all the Russian intelligence agencies used all of academia from 1917 to 1989 to craft how they targeted messages. This was just sloppy. It was literally like hearing people in a bar drink.
Sure, but let me ask you this then, because they claimed that my family has a dacha directly next door to Vladimir Putin. And then they claimed that one of my family members is the largest real estate developer in Moscow, right? Which he's never even been to Moscow. I mean, so there's a lot of Russia included into this. But what bothered me the most is why our law enforcement, never put an end to it, even though that they knew. They wanted to keep this document alive. And that's part of the second book that I have coming out.
The stuff that was real, that the stuff that had any viability would have been found out in the Mueller investigation, which, with one exception, the Mueller investigation never, ever investigated the counterintelligence aspects of Trump. That is, was he an unwitting asset? Was he a witting asset? When would he been influenced? All of that stuff was not in their mandate to find out, whether Donald Trump had been on the take or any of that.
A useful idiot.
Yeah,
right.
Well, he started as a useful idiot. He moved on to an unwitting asset and then became a witting asset on the night that he said,
Mazel tov. Mazel tov. If there was a glass, I would break it. Let me just move on, Malcolm, and ask you this, right? What are the chances that Putin widens the war into places like Moldova or the Baltics or even Poland to prevent NATO from resupplying Ukraine from the West?
Well, I'll tell you, he won't move into Poland because there's nothing left to move. I'm telling you, I very early on, I think it was on your show, but while I was in Ukraine, where I was saying, I don't think they can take that country. They don't have enough men. Granted, Russia could declare a national emergency and mobilize 1 million conscripts, right? 1 million Russians to come out there. But that's 1 million Russians that would go get their asses kicked. Now, all you could do is just march over dead bodies, right? I mean, just let them pile up left and right, but they won't attack Poland because that's NATO. That's just straight up NATO. 30 countries, well, 32, because Sweden and Finland will come on our side, and they will just, boom, obliterate the Russian Air Force and go into open warfare that would probably end with him threatening to use atomic bombs, if not using them. But Ukraine right now, he's getting it handed to him. And the only place that I'm with you, I think Moldova is a very scary prospect. There are only 2 battalion task force in Moldova, which is just, a couple of thousand guys. And the Ukrainians actually have the capacity to help, because that's not even Moldova. It's a strip along the border called Transnistria. And the Moldovan government, which is very friendly to NATO, which is very friendly to Ukraine, is very concerned about this. And they would probably ask, Hungary or not Hungary, Bulgaria to come and assist them. I mean, now you're talking a NATO nation, which would be doing a, cross-border security event, now getting into it with them. But I think the Ukrainians would have, since they haven't taken Odessa and they're not going to take Odessa, I think Ukrainians could probably handle that problem in no time. But Putin is throwing these countries' names up: Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, all these places, like he wants to get the band back together again and recreate the Soviet Union. I think he has another thing coming. One other thing, there's this threat from that Belarus may enter the war in the West, north of Lviv, and would come down to cut the border posts down there. And I was in Lviv recently. Cut the lines of supply. No, they wouldn't. This is what would happen. They would get savaged as they come across that border. They would be bogged down like they are in Kyiv. You would have lots of dead Belarusians because now you have a lot of combat experienced Ukrainians. And then there would be a revolution in Belarus that would overthrow that government. And then you get 2 countries that want to be in NATO. On Putin's door. And they would probably, I don't know if Russia's bought any nuclear weapons into Belarus like they threatened to do. But what if that happens? The government collapses overnight and Belarusians get they have tactical nuclear weapons. They become an instant nuclear power. This is just too fraught with danger for Vladimir Putin. But then again, he said people thought he wouldn't invade Ukraine.
Right. Except for the fact that this isn't the first time, right? So let me ask you this, Malcolm, then. The Putin wing of the Republican Party has become a major embarrassment for mainstream Republicans who claim that they're just a fringe group. Now, we suspect it's much larger than that. At least I do. I believe that. If you would, discuss with me what you know of these pro-Russian, pro-Putin factions within the United States, because I've heard you describe them as fifth column. Who are they and how dangerous are they to this country?
Fascinating question.
Thank you. Here, Mea Culpa, Malcolm, we do our homework.
It's a good question because I wrote a book in 2018 called The Plot to Destroy Democracy, how Putin and his spies were damaging America and dismantling the West.
I read it while I was in Otisville, by the way.
Oh, great. Because it was really about how there is a strategic plan by Putin to dismantle all Western democracies by funding right-wing extremist neo-fascist organizations, which is what's so funny. When Putin talks about denazification, he can start with the biker gang that protects him, right? The mafia biker gang that protects him. right? These guys are straight up effing Nazis. And his United Russia Party they sponsored and funded the government of Austria that collapsed a couple of years ago in a scandal, which was started by two SS officers in 1952. He supports neo-fascist movements around Europe. He funded Alternative for Deutschland. He funded Marine Le Pen in France, the Front National, and all of them were under the nominal anti-immigrant banner, but they were really anti-democracy fascists. So it's fascinating to me that one of the other components, not one of them, the other wings that he had sort of bought over 10 years was first the American evangelical movement. And they started having, right after 9/11, there were these, and after the Beslan massacre in Russia, hardcore right-wing evangelicals were going to Russia and aligning with these Orthodox Russian Christian extremists. And then they were being sponsored by the Russian government to come over there for these protection of Christianity conferences. And it got to the point where Franklin Graham became a regular attendee, and the view within the evangelical movement was these are white Christians defending Western European democracy against Islam in a clash of civilizations. And what's fascinating about this is Osama bin Laden believed the exact same thing, that Islam was supposed to be in a clash of civilizations with Europe. When Trump was elected president and he went to Poland and made his grand speech about clash of cultures, he was speaking to these people, and it was all being funded and backed by Russia. So evangelicals see Russia as the last bastion of great white Christianity in the world, full of hot chicks. That's another unspoken part of this story that I've discovered that ISIS and right-wing extremists have alike. They love their view of porn from Eastern Europe is almost identical. So you remember the old marriage mills from Russia. Well, to show you an example of how pervasive that is, the next target was the National Rifle Association. And they sent what we call a marginally attractive young woman named Maria Butina to the United States with a seemingly influential guy who turned out their mission was to turn the NRA the NRA was fascinated with the AK-47, wanted to get into the Russian market, more weapons, more ammunition because of an Obama administration rule. They all had to be manufactured in the US. Believe me, I've heard it all. I'm a gun owner, right? So I've heard all this. But the Russians understood that if you co-opt the NRA, you co-opt another third of the Republican Party, if not half of it. And so this young woman who one day when she was 19 was a furniture saleswoman in Siberia, and then pops up a couple of years later at age 23, and she's co-heading this right to bear arms group, and then is sent to the United States. And it would later be found out she was going around and sort of having relations with various people in the organization or getting very close to them. The FBI arrested her as a spy. An unregistered foreign agent is the term we use for spy. They believed that she was a Russian clandestine intelligence service officer who was there with this other person to co-opt the right-wing extremists in the NRA. She got to ask Donald Trump the first question in Las Vegas, Nevada, about, are you going to have friendly relationships with Russia? A very successful spy operation. And the last leg was the alt-right, Steve Bannon's little world, right? This guy almost created the alt-right. The alt-right are intensely friendly to Putin. David Duke owned an apartment. He may still own an apartment in Moscow. Richard Spencer, the head of the American neo-Nazis, would go over and stay there. Spencer's wife was a pro-Moscow Ukrainian who is translating the documents of Alexander Dugin, the guy who designed the entire strategy of Putin knocking down Western democracy. These people are incestuous. So that's how the American right is in the sway of Putin. But now they're fighting these underdogs who have guns, and you can go there and join their army, and they're confused.
You know? Right. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is crazy. You know, I what I didn't understand is, Maria Butina, she was no beauty. I mean, some of these, Russians that they have. I mean, you want to talk about good looking? I mean, they are stunning. I would have wanted to send somebody who's a little bit more, but then again, that would be my mistake, because then it would be too in your face. So I guess she probably fit exactly what they were looking for.
Tradecraft. You don't send one who's someone, what we call a Svetlana, right? You don't send somebody who would look good in a freaking, Mercedes McLaren. You don't, because she's just too good looking. You send somebody.
I would be bad at this spy shit.
You wouldn't be particularly good. You send somebody who cleans up nicely and looks good holding an AK-47 to a bunch of fat rubes who would never be allowed in the same room with somebody who is clean, attractive, come from overseas, have Kalashnikov. Okay, it was a beautiful intelligence operation in the way that it was executed. And she became boyfriends with a guy who was very influential and helped open all those doors to everyone in the NRA. It was this will be studied for decades as to how stupid all these American guys are, because some woman with an accent, not even as, as interesting as Natasha Fatal from Rocky and Bullwinkle, but would just come over and could buy the entire NRA.
or Madam Yes from the Flintstones.
That's right, Madam.
Remember that? Now let me ask you this, because you were there in Kiev and so on. Because I've heard rumors that Russia is planning to use chemical weapons as they close in on Kiev. Is there any truth to this? And what's the U.S. response at that point? Because I know that it was supposed to be a red line in Syria, right? Had this all happened. What's the deal here? Can you unpack this for me?
This is the toughest question of your show. I mean, it's worse than nukes. Because
can I tell you why Malcolm, can I interrupt you for 1 second and tell you why it's the toughest question? Because I actually have no clue what the answer is.
Oh, it's even worse than that. Because once you have the answer, you won't like it. And you'll be walking around frightened. The thing about nukes is that everyone knows how awful they are. That if you decide you want to use one, there are people in the chain of command who can resolve your issue with a bullet, right? No one wants to see their children burn or die of radiation poisoning and the world just come to an end. Nobody. No one will turn that key. Okay? No one. And there are people who may think about it. There are people who may get to the point of turning it, but they'll be like, no. Especially people in the military. But chemical weapons, on the other hand, that's a fascinating little world, because Russia has facilitated the use of chemical weapons in many instances, including carrying out not just in Syria. In Syria, they just use mass nerve agent, right? They use sarin gas. They dropped it in sections of Damascus, Aleppo, other parts, knowing that these people were going into basements. And Russia had this clean them out like rats strategy. And the problem they had in Chechnya was there were all these Westerners watching. So they just had to level the cities. And the problem is their guerrillas were down in the basements. Well, in Syria, using Russian advice, they dropped sarin gas. They had used it a few times before. It wasn't as effective. Russia helped them focus it so that they bombed all the upper buildings, all the fire departments, all the top part structures, and left the basements intact. When the people ran to the basement, they dropped sarin gas. Sarin gas is heavier. It goes into the basement and it kills everybody. Right, one drop of that will send you into violent convulsions. Your heart will stop and you'll die. So Russia saw how successful that Syria used it, because there was no Western response. When that red line was drawn, I made a recommendation on air. And I said, that the Obama administration, the red line should be simply this. You will change the military dynamic of the Middle East. You will destroy the entirety of the Syrian Air Force, all of it. Every effing runway, every effing aircraft, every effing helicopter. And you go, I'm leaving it up to the Israelis now. Okay, now you use chemical weapons, Israel gets total air supremacy in the Middle East. They didn't do that, right? Because they looked to Congress, because he's such a kumbaya guy, they looked to Congress to give him permission. That is always wrong. You cannot go in an emergency by committee. The Russians have taken that lesson, and now what they're thinking of doing is making what we call a false flag attack. They're claiming today all of the people killed by artillery bombardments were killed by Ukrainian artillery, even though that Russians have a 20-1 domination of artillery in Ukraine, and we can watch it with our own eyes. Russia will just lie about it. Now they're claiming the Ukrainians are planning to kill off their own citizens with chemical weapons. That's like a giant bullhorn saying Russia is about to use chemical weapons. Now, what happens when that happens? I'm looking over here to see if I have my gas mask, which I did carry, just in case I go over. But what happens when that happens? Now we are at a crossroads, because that's not a joke. If they'll use chemical weapons, and Russia is used, by the way, Russia did a chemical weapons attack on England when they tried to poison an ex-KGB agent his daughter. And it killed 2 people who had
because they simply touched him. I think that's called Novichok. Novichok,
the most virulent chemical weapon in the world. All right. Obviously, they had mellowed it out. They had put it into a little spray bottle. That was a chemical weapons attack on England, not on an individual, on England. We should have busted them right then and there. And they've carried it out on Navalny. Right? They hit him again with the same thing.
They did it also to the guy Yanukovych. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I mean, look.
Polonium. That's even worse. Polonium can only be produced. That's a radiological attack in a nuclear reactor that is creating plutonium for atomic bombs. And it's like a microscopic offshoot of that. And Putin used that to show he could use the single most rare weapon on earth.
Yeah, I remember Yanukovych's face was like falling off and so on. But let me ask you this. It was just terrible. I mean, look, there's so much stuff. And what I also heard with it, Novichok, they have a way now, not just by doing it into an aerosol, but they have it with almost like an adhesive. That's a one-way adhesive on the outside of the hand, and they slap you on the back of the neck, or they touch you as you're walking or something in it. And it's so terrible because it's almost irreversible, obviously, right? But let me move on for a second and ask you this.
Let me digress for one moment. So you've seen a lot of dead children here recently on television.
Yes.
Now I want you to start thinking of dead children who have choked and vomited from a chemical weapon in these basements. Women and children who look like, the average American. You're going to have a violent political reaction. Even the Republicans.
Malcolm, it's identical to the images that we remember during the Holocaust in Auschwitz and other death camps where they used to gas them. And you're right. If that happens, it should be all out fucking attack. It better be. So let me ask you this thing, because I'm curious. Did you have any contact with the feared Azov regiment that's currently fighting in Mariupol while you were there? I mean, are they comprised of extreme far-right elements as described neo-Nazis? And if so, how do we balance the need to defeat the Russian forces without the kind of blowback that we saw in Afghanistan? I mean, are we simply arming what could become a hostile faction against the Zelensky administration, something we've seen happen before?
Well, first off, the Azov battalion is actually in Mariupol and are surrounded by the Russians. So there may not be an Azov battalion here very soon. I'm not joking. There were members, I mean, this is a big thing. There were members in the Azov battalion, just as there were members in the US Marine Corps and the US Army and the US Navy who had taken and who were right-wing extremists. And the Ukrainian government has been trying to counteract this image. Russia used this as the denazification of Ukraine, which is run by a Jew, a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, to claim that every person in Ukraine is a Nazi. Well, I spent the entire month of January and February here. Haven't met any Nazis. What I met were a lot of people that love democracy, a lot of people that love the United States. I've met no neo-Nazis whatsoever. And that group, and the reason people were aligning this to it, and crazy Laura Logan going out and calling it an occult group, is because someone had made up a patch, not the official patch of the organization, that had been using the Schutzstaffen, the SS symbol, and a symbol called the Sonnenrad. Okay, the Sonnenrad is like a continual series of L shapes that create the sunrise, right? That some people have interpreted, the same people who watch Ancient Aliens, that meant that it was an occult symbol of Nazi Germany. And it was in the home of a former Nazi officer that people use. That I said this on the other day, and Jimmy Dore, some guy named Jimmy Dore, criticized me. I don't know who he is, but there are as many Nazis in the U.S. Armed Forces, and I served for 20 years. I've seen guys with swastika tattoos. Then there are members of the entire Azov brigade. Again, that organization is going to cease to exist here soon. They're probably not going to survive the siege of Mariupol. The reason it's called the Azov Brigade, okay, is because, they're stationed on the Sea of Azov. So that's where Mariupol is. Now, could there have been members who were Nazis? Of course there were members who were Nazis. We've seen their patches, we've seen these guys. But if there's 20 guys in a regiment of 1,200 in an army of 265,000 people, that does not represent the entirety of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia is terrified of democracy. And now they've pulled the spirit of Nazis from World War II to get the old people out in Siberia to support this crazy war.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you what we really need. We need to bring back the group from Inglourious Bastards like Lieutenant Aldo Raines, and we need to send the Jew bear in there with the baseball bat, right? And this whole war will be over in about a week, right? He just hasn't walked out of the bag the thing, right? Could you imagine and start doing it? But let me say this.
By the way, I saw a Ukrainian Jew in uniform last time I was there, because he wore the short Israeli hat. I could just tell everything about him shouted Israeli army, the gear, everything.
Well, we need to give him a Louisville Slugger. So, look, on a more grisly note, right? I read a piece in CNN about the problem of Russian corpses piling up literally across Ukraine as the ground begins to thaw and the weather starts to get warmer. Now, it's a sign of how the Kremlin is hiding the true toll that the war has taken, right? They're hiding this information from their own people. How much of this are you encountering as Russian forces are now getting pushed back? And what do they do with them? What do they do with the bodies? Because they are not picking them up. They are not, transporting them to an area in order to send them back. I understand that they also have like crematoriums, traveling crematoriums. I mean, this is really fucking brutal, and I'll tell you one thing, because, you really don't want to piss off the mothers of these Russian service members, right? You really don't. And when you're lying to your people and you're saying that there's under 2,000 of our soldiers have died, and then ultimately that number is going to come out, well in excess of 30,000. And, right. These kids, these service members don't come home. Well, they didn't travel to Vegas. Let me put it to you that way.
Well, the city of Dnipro alone, and I saw that report. It was horrific. The city
Horrific.
of Dnipro alone, when they showed the refrigerated tractor trailer, he said there's 300 bodies in this one and 200 bodies in that one. And those bodies were transported just in the immediate area, further down near Zaporizhzhia and all these other areas, because he said we can't leave the bodies in the street. It's a hazard, and not to mention their own dead that they have out there. I know in the city of Kharkiv right now, there was that one report on BBC. A body has been, bodies have been in the street for a week because the Russians bombard every person that comes for the bodies to kill more civilians. These people aren't disappearing. The senior officers who are being killed are being sent home with state funerals. But what happens when you accidentally send back 5,000 bodies and you're telling everybody that it's 2,000 bodies and that some group starts counting? That's the point. By releasing that there are deaths in this war, Russia is masking any funerals that you're seeing. Right?
Well, let me change that for a second. It's not Russia that's masking it. It's Vladimir Putin.
Right.
I'm not happy to see when they'll show on television, say, graphic visual, right, and so on, and you see a whole slew of these Russian soldiers that are dead on the street. Many of them have no idea why they're even there. It's very. I don't want to see anybody lose their life, and not for something as stupid as this, which was Putin's wanton disregard for Ukraine's democracy and Ukraine's sovereignty. I mean, and obviously, I don't care what anybody says, this has to be all over oil, because this is all over money. And somewhere along the line, I don't know whether there's a ton of oil that's sitting in Crimea or in the Donbass area, but he went in there for a reason. This guy didn't go in there for no reason at all.
The Ukrainian wheat harvest. That soil, I've seen that soil. That soil is black as the ace of spades. That has got to be the most nutritious soil I have ever seen. It's not a joke about, they say you could spit a seed on the ground and it will grow. It will. This place is, I can't remember the statistic of how much of the world's grain is grown in Ukraine. But you notice when they took the port of Berdansk, the first thing they did was they stole 3 grain carriers and sailed them to Russia. Yeah. So, it's a combination of things. But I think Russia being the breadbasket, or Ukraine being the breadbasket of Europe, may be the principal motivator.
Could be. But since we're talking about food and so on, if you'd be so kind, describe for me, if you can, the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Mariupol and places that have, seen the full brunt of the Russian war machine. Do you think that they'll do in Kiev what they've done in Mariupol?
Well, first off, they can't. And there's indications that the task group that was northwest of Kiev for the last month may, in fact, themselves be wiped out, may being encircled in Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha, which is the center of their combat power. So the city of Kyiv, I understand it has been relatively peaceful. All the people, I've got people there who say it's all outgoing artillery, other than that rocket hit that occurred at that mall the other day. It's all dozens and dozens and dozens of rounds of outgoing artillery. So something's going on in Kyiv. Mariupol, different animal. Their back is to the sea, right? They are surrounded on all sides by the Russians. There is no relief, and they are just killing every person in the city they see. They keep claiming they want to open up humanitarian corridors. They open them, people line up, they bombard the people. They are going to raze that city to the ground. I think they said 90% of the city has been hit, has been struck by at least one shell. 40% of the city is leveled, gone, uninhabitable. And most people are living in the basements and they have 2 to 3 days food. So at some point, the civilians may capitulate, but I think Moscow intends to do to that city what they did to Grozny, Chechnya, which is kill every living person in it. And the thing is, we can't, there's nothing we can do
Malcolm,
about it.
Right. But that creates a problem, right? At least in my mind, because I've heard stories, now maybe not in Mariupol, but I've heard stories of Russian forces turning on one another, right, during this this war, or begging for mercy when captured, as they're forced, by threat of execution to fight. Right. Now, have your encounters been like these Russian soldiers? And what are you hearing about their morale and their fitness? Because they're suffering from lack of food too.
Yeah, and they're marauding. They're doing foraging all over. They're breaking into people's houses. They're stealing food. They're
What houses? What houses? Most of them have been leveled.
Well, out in the country, there's quite a bit, and they're going into apartments and just gathering food. They're foraging through, by knowing they're going to starve the population. Killing chickens everywhere. That's all you hear is reports the Russians stole their chickens. The Russians stole their chickens. The Russians really control nothing other than the road that they are on. All those red swaths you see on CNN and MSNBC, not real. It should be thin red lines of where their convoys are and nothing else. But their army is very demoralized. They most of them did not know what they were there for or where they were going. They said only the senior officers were briefed. Junior officers were briefed 24 hours before and were only allowed to talk to the senior officers, and the average Joe wasn't briefed at all. There's a famous case near Chernihiv where they caught 4 guys who pulled a BMP over at a gas station, and the Ukrainians were opening fire on them, and they were like, whoa, 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 why are you shooting at us? And they go, you're invading our country. He goes, no, we're on an exercise. I mean, those were like the first 5 guys caught. They were a reconnaissance platoon and didn't know they were in Ukraine. They thought they were in Belarus. So that being one thing, I have seen the testimony of soldiers who said, yes, they are shooting you if you go to the rear. I have emphasized, and I've spoken to people here, who were in Ukraine, where I said, you've really got to start working on your psychological operations. You really have to start putting up signs that say, something along the lines of shoot all your ammunition in the air, tell them you ran out of gas, and go hide up in the woods till we come and get you. You know what
your story reminds me of? Your story reminds me of the movie Tropic Thunder, right? Where they drop Ben Stiller, a bunch of the other actors and so on into the middle of a real jungle, as opposed to onto a set, and they're like, whoa, what are you firing at? What are you firing at? We're here, and we're actors. Yeah, it's truly no joke. I mean,
and the producer steps on a landmine and blows up, right?
Exactly.
These guys are getting it, and here's the one thing. I said this on air many, many times on MSNBC, and I was ridiculed the first week. I said I had been to Donbass. I had met all the senior commanders. I've been all over that country, every major city. I said, these people are going to fight, and they can win this war. And everyone was like, no, Russia's going to take it in 72 hours. After 72 hours, I was starting to see some major failures. And I said, they're never going to win this war. They don't have enough manpower. The Nazis bought 1.4 million men through Ukraine to take that country. And the Soviets had to bring 2.5 million to cleanse it of Nazis. So what do you think 178,000 guys are going to do?
Not when you're fighting 30 million Ukrainians that want their sovereignty and are willing to die. And they're willing to die for it. Men, women, older, younger, it makes no difference. But Malcolm, as the hour now comes to an end, I know that time goes by quickly on Mea Culpa. I have one last question for you, but I want to switch gears. And I've asked this now to several of my guests here on the show. I want to discuss Mo Brooks and the January 6th committee. Could Mo Brooks's recent falling out with Trump unearth new information on what happened that day that could ultimately link the insurrectionists with lawmakers? What's your understanding? What's your knowledge on that?
I think so, because here's the pathway that I'm looking for. Ali Alexander, who is this right-wing extremist guy who claims he coordinated with Mo Brooks and others to plan the seizure of to plan the protest that would lead to the seizure of the building. But we also have now found out that the White House itself manufactured the entire bring in fake electors fraud scam, right? That's straight up fraud of official documents that were actually sent to the National Archives. But also the element that the Proud Boys, the 3%ers, and the Oath Keepers may also have been briefed in to actually carry out the insurrection itself in order to stop the steal, which, by the way, was a phrase popularized by Roger Stone, who was also there. So I think that Mo Brooks flipping could give them a witness to Trump. But you know how it is with guys in the Trump camp. When they flip one day, the next day they say, oh, I was misinterpreted. And, and Trump comes back to, or someone threatens their life or the life of their child.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, when I decided to cooperate, the same shit started. All of a sudden, they come at you from every angle that they possibly can. And, I wasn't giving up, and I refuse to give up now in terms of this, situation. But, one of the things that I actually heard, and it really, I found it very, very disconcerting, to be honest with you, was the fact that they were using, there's a whole story on the usage of burner phones, right? That was going on. And allegedly there's a guy that's now been called in. He's a young kid. And he's been called in to the January 6th committee because he's the guy that bought these 3 burner phones for, this is an allegation, and we're going to find out if it's true or not, because I know he's due before the committee in a couple of days, but his statement is that he bought these burner phones for Amy and Kylie Kramer, who were involved in the rally, the Ellipse rally, right, and that he was there while they were speaking to Mark Meadows, and so on. And there's so much stuff that's going on here. But what bothers me the most about all of this is they have already now interviewed probably 500 people. And they have the receipts for these burner phones. They have knowledge on where and who paid for it. And the guy who bought them with somebody else's money, at a CVS. It's crazy. It's crazy that more people haven't been indicted. And I'm not talking about people like the Oath Keepers or the 1%ers of this asshole group or that asshole group. I'm talking about fucking lawmakers, the same people that helped them map out where Nancy Pelosi's office was, where Mike Pence was going to be, where the Senate chamber is. Those are the people that need to be held accountable. These other unwitting fools, they're just pawns in a game.
Mm-hmm. But none of it wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump hadn't opened his mouth.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can't argue with you on that, my brother. But listen, Malcolm, you stay safe. When are you coming back to the States?
Yeah, I should be back in a few weeks. We'll see.
It's funny because I wanted to go to Poland. I made a request, both to, the Bureau of Prisons, my father being born in Poland and my wife being born in Southwest Ukraine. I just felt, I wanted to go there and assist. My wife is from the area. Well, we always called it Chernivtsi. They call it Chernovitz, which is by the Moldova border. And my father was born.
It's a big border crossing. Chernovitz.
Yep, exactly. My dad was born in Bochnia, Poland, and didn't leave until, of course, after the war. It was a unfortunate, going through the entire Holocaust situation. So, I just thought it would be a good thing. And if I do, I'm going to reach out to you. We'll see each other in person.
Get together. It's a great place, and I'll introduce you to the people over at the Auschwitz Foundation. I've spoken there twice.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Malcolm, and please stay safe, and I'll see you when you're back on land side.
All right. Take care.